Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Book Talks, a series of conversations with authors about their books, hosted collaboratively by Pittsburgh Theological Seminary's Center for Writing and Learning Support and the Barber Library. My name is Shan Overton, and I'm the director of the Center for Writing and Learning Support here at the seminary, along with my Barber Library colleagues, Director Michelle Spomer and User Services Librarian Tisha Wu. I'd like to say we are glad you are here online via Zoom to celebrate Loving What Doesn't Last, an Adoration of the Body, a beautiful, reflective, and pastoral theological book by our guest, PTS alumna, the Reverend Christina Kukuk. Before we launch into our conversation, a few more announcements to make. Please be aware we are recording this event and it will be available for viewing on the Book Talks page of the PTS website and on our YouTube channel in the coming weeks. Second, you can check in your chat window for links to the PTS Book Talk page and to Amazon and bookshop.org, where you can purchase Christina's book. Additionally, the Barber Library has created a LibGuide, a library guide, of resources linked to the theological themes covered in this book. Look in the chat for the Book Talk LibGuide link to this conversation and the book Loving What Doesn't Last. Also, I'd like to begin with a few thank yous to my colleagues in the library who've done so much to make this time possible, well beyond the LibGuide. Also, a big thank you to Holly McKelvey, the Writing Center's administrative assistant, who registered all of you and helped us to get the word out about the event. Our communications department, Melissa Logan and Robin Menard especially, are owed a debt of gratitude as they publicize this evening's book talk. And as always, a special thank you to our unbelievable IT department, the talented Bobby Jarsulik, who is behind the scenes right now, handling everything that might come up technologically. Our format today will be the following. I'll offer a little from Christina's biography and ask her a few opening questions about the book and how it came into being. I also have invited her to read a little from the book, and we'll be delighted to hear from her from one of her chapters. As we are talking and as she is reading, I want to encourage you to think of questions of your own. Please use the chat and/or the Q&A to type yours up, and we will keep an eye on the chat and the Q&A and voice those questions for you. We believe that active participation by the audience is very important, and so we encourage that. One more quick note for those who are on Zoom. You'll see a live transcription button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to read along with us. And as one more note, just please see the links in the chat for purchasing Christina's book, also for her website, and again, for the LibGuides. And I'm seeing there's a question about emailing the links to participants, and Tisha Wu, our librarian, has said they would be happy to email the links out to the group. So thank you for that question already. And now to formally introduce our guest, the Reverend Christina Grace Kukuk. Her website on her website, she says she, and I quote here, grew up on a hill in the middle of nowhere in Northeast Ohio, which is a great way of talking about where you grew up. And in, as she says, that little piece of Appalachia in a brethren community, her words were forged and have traveled with her across the country and into her sermons and other writings, and with her today into this space. In her first career, Christina was a newspaper and magazine reporter who worked for the Akron Beacon Journal after completing a journalism degree at Kent State University. She later attended PTS, Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, for her MDiv, and is now an ordained UCC pastor with more than 15 years of experience in congregations in Minnesota, Ohio, and now in Oregon. She served for a time as editor of the UCC women's magazine, Common Lot. Her freelance writing work, including essays and poetry, have appeared in Belt Magazine, The Christian Century, Bearings Online, and Spirituality and Health. Loving What Doesn't Last, the book we are discussing today, was published in October 2021 by Morehouse Publishing in New York. About herself, Christina says, a writer, editor, and refugee of the Fourth Estate, I'm also an ordained pastor puttering in the spiritual R&D department of wherever Jesus is taking us next. What I look for is love showing up with skin on, right here. And I just love that intro. And so with that, Christina, it seems so appropriate to say welcome to you, because that relates so much to this book that we are talking about today. So glad you're here.
Thank you so much. And I am really delighted. It seems like forever ago that I was driving every Tuesday morning. I'm not a morning person, but I was a long distance commuter to PTS. And so for 3 years, I drove every Tuesday morning, stayed with a classmate 2 nights, tried to cram all my classes into those 3 days and then drive back. I just really delighted to be able to reconnect with the seminary and with my classmates and the alumni and folks there. So thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I really have appreciated this book so much. I mean, you know, you never know what you're going to get when you sign up to read a book. And this one has been such a wonderful joy for me to read. And I wanted to actually start out with the first question that I had was about this idea of words being forged that you have in your bio on your website. And, you know, and how a place forges words. And I was wondering, like, when you think of that, what are the dimensions of the forging? And how do you envision being in a particular place, being from a particular community, shaping your words in that way? So much that it's lasted all this time.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. I think it's how and where our words are formed, I think happens, our awareness of it, I think happens more in retrospect. It was when I moved out here to Oregon that a friend who's an artist was doing these really small encaustic paintings of places that were important to us. And I think it was I gave myself the birthday present of asking for a small, it's just 4x4 encaustic of the hill where I grew up in the middle of Northeast Ohio. And that's where I spent the first 11 years of my life. And I think the ways our early life, the ways our intense experiences shape us, show their fruit later so often. When I moved here to Oregon, the climate is very different. So how my body experienced the climate here in Southern Oregon, it felt strange and different. And I missed the humidity of being around the Great Lakes. I missed the humidity of Ohio. And I was longing for home. And I asked commissioned that little personal 4x4 encaustic. It hangs over my writing desk, I think, partly because I want to know where I came from and not be disconnected from what made me. I think in ministry, we are again in crucibles of time and space. We are accompanying people, families, sometimes through the worst days of their lives. And those experiences shape us too. They make us who we are later. So I love that you've connected that. I came up with that image when I first shared about having a burn barrel on our property when I was a kid, and realizing most people didn't grow up with a burn barrel where you burned up all your garbage, right? You know, because you didn't have, anyway. So I was like, oh, that gives, that's a different, that shaped my experience, but it's not necessarily everyone else's experience. So I think it's interesting that you highlighted that, because I think that our ministry experiences, where we go after seminary, the places that we go with faith communities also become crucibles, things that shape us and refine us and form us.
Yeah. And that actually was one question that I had sort of as a follow-up, which is just, you know, the ways in which your words are being forged anew in the new place you are, Oregon, in the ministries that you're doing now, and in and through your writing, because in a sense, writing is a crucible also. I mean, you know, picking up on what you're saying. And I'm wondering, I guess, how do you see that moving itself forward? I mean, it feels like this book is actually connecting a bunch of threads, including this, you know, a sense of embodiment from the past as well as words from the past, but also then weaving that in. And so I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit, because I found that to be a interesting part of the book for me.
Yeah. You know, when I went to seminary, for, you know, quarter life crisis, it was after 9/11, and a lot of us had kind of vocational, vocational aha moments in the early 2000s, I think. And I really thought that I was going to be, you know, my vision for my life was that I was going to be a newspaper and magazine journalist. And a little bit younger, I wanted to be a, you know, international correspondent. I had plans, right? And I got this sweet job out of college at the Akron Beacon Journal. And it was in the early 2000s, right before the print media, you know, crash of advertising that was in free fall. And then, so I was laid off. I had my first experience of a layoff. And then I worked in a nonprofit for a little while, writing content. And I had what you might call a quarter life crisis, kind of a crashing of this vision for what I thought life was going to be with the reality that I was living in. And going to seminary was part of answering what felt like the Spirit's call in that disorientation time. I wasn't planning to go to seminary. As I've said other places, it's not something that was a career option for women where I grew up. And the Spirit leads us, especially if we're listening to what other people are seeing and experiencing in us. So I went to seminary, and there was a way in which at that time I thought, oh, well, this is my new vocation, right? It was so affirming. The first time I stepped into the pulpit to preach was almost an out of body experience. I'm an introvert, so this was a surprise to me that I had gifts and a calling for preaching. And there was a way in which in some aspect, in some ways, I thought, oh, okay, well, now I've found God's plan for my life. And I have, and I disconnected a little bit from the writing at that point. I still journaled. It took some really difficult things in ministry in my first senior pastorate for me to reintegrate the writing as part of my vocation. And it happened because of the crucible of really intense pastoral care experiences, some of which formed and shaped this, some of which were the genesis of this book. I didn't know that at the time. At the time, I needed some place to put the intense experience of showing up in an ER room with the son of a family who had died through some kind of overdose, whether it was an accident or we're still not sure, and accompanying that family through that excruciating grief and loss. I needed a place to put that. And so writing and the poem Organ Donor came out of that experience. And it was more, I needed a container to put all the ways in which I was being impacted by accompanying them. I was at the time nursing my own infant son, and in the crashing of those two realities, the loss of a son and the nurturing and of a son, just smashed together. And so it was the poem I wrote partly for me to deal with what was going on. That's how I process what I'm thinking and feeling. And it took a few years for me to realize that poem actually wanted to have a wider audience, isn't the right word, that it was a gift that was meant to be shared. And I did check with the family first. I had read it in like a open night kind of thing. I actually read it for a friend in Scotland first, and then I read it for an open mic at a workshop, and wasn't going to print or publish it, except that people were impacted by it. And so I went back to the family and said, how would you feel about me sharing this more widely? Would that be okay with you? And the response was, if there was something good that could come out of this devastation, please share it. So
yeah, that totally comes across as, in reading it. That's a really powerful chapter for sure, that kind of galvanizes a lot of other things that happen in the book, like a lot of else refracts around it. I didn't mean to cut you off if you were trying to say something else.
No, that's okay. I'm a preacher, so you'll have to cut me off sometimes. We tend to go on and on and on. I have another story for you. No, that's okay.
Right. Well, speaking of other stories, I'd love it if you would read a chapter for us, so that the listeners here can get a sense of your voice in the book and some of the themes in the book. And let me disappear so that you can have the floor. Sure,
I'll take a glass of. You never know you have a congested throat until you start trying to talk to someone, right?
Right, exactly. That's exactly right.
All right. Yeah, I'd be happy to read. I'm going to read from the section titled Birth. The book is really in 6 movements. And the first one is Birth. And this is the section bearing from before to after. The last time I saw Jane's face, her forehead and cheekbones bore bruises from the bloody eruption in her brain. Sores flared in her nose where the feeding tube had been threaded through, and her lips peeled away in cracked, papery flakes. Those wounds did not unnerve me. Her eyes did. When she saw me, recognition flashed through them, then memory, I supposed, of what my presence meant or could mean. I tried to smile, to reassure, to pray and to bless, but I couldn't take away the fear. And who could blame her? I had buried her husband not 6 weeks before. Closing long years of days darkened by a tumor, she had stood near me, weeping, as I blessed and anointed his body, wasted, but still animated by circulating blood. Now she was the one in the hospital bed. We had been told she was on the mend, so I joked. These are prayers of thanks and healing, not last rites. She tried to laugh as I smeared the suspicious oil above her brow. But the face my thumb touched is gone now, gone within days, leaving behind a stupidly insufficient string of adjectives, extinguished, passed on, snuffed, stolen. Our bodies green and bloat so quickly. We are fruit with a limited shelf life. Her face so quickly taking on the shade of a bruised Bartlett pear, her eyes closed to light, perishable. That a religion would claim God chose to get all wrapped up in this thin skin still shocks and surprises. He was God and then became man, wrote Athanasius of Alexandria, and that to deify us. To claim this should make all the difference in how we live and die in these bodies. I have a groupie's affection for funeral directors, I admit it. After countless hours in a hearse, killing time, picking the brains of morticians, my admiration for the care and compassion the good ones give only grows. I marvel at their work with corpses, the technical skill, the surgeon's precision. I file away the equally heroic and uncomfortable facts of organ donation. For example, tissue recovery technicians always replace organic material with some synthetic approximation. But the human circulatory system is a closed circuit, difficult to seal once opened. In a town where embalmed open casket viewings are the norm, the devil could live in these details. and really spook a family without the tactful intervention of a good funeral home. In 5.5 years pastoring one church, I performed a funeral almost every month. Each forehead, each hand began to feel unbearably precious. I wondered if I could trace the origin of that reverence to my surreptitious study of surgical magazines as a 13-year-old. Poring over them, I grasped with a kind of ignorance some sense of the words I've since prayed from a fraying book most Wednesdays for a decade. O God of heaven, you have made your home on earth in the broken body of creation. Kindle within me a love for you in all things. A dead body differs so much from a living one, even an almost dead, rasping carcass, the kind whose flesh seems to jump the gun on its disintegrating job days, weeks, or months before the heart stops. Even these bodies live, often stubbornly so. Miriam's yellow wax bean face, propped with a towel by the hospice nurse until her 2 daughters could get there, and her father's face, propped in almost the same pose a few weeks later in a room just across the hall. Both differed from the not yet dead. They were alive. And then, in what felt like moments, they were not. A person can bear to care for the body on one side of the great divide or the other, and even rejoice in the work. But I may never grow used to shouldering a body as it crosses from before to after. No dotted line of surgical marker directs the way to fixing this. For we too are children and gods by grace, another powerful churchman of Alexandria once wrote. And we have surely been brought to this wonderful and supernatural dignity since we have the only begotten Word of God dwelling within us. I weigh the arm or hand or head I chance to cradle in my own perishable palm, and I can only pray.
Thank you, Christina. That was so beautiful. There's such a poetry to your writing. I mean, there's poetry in the book, but also in the prose itself. And thank you for reading it. It's wonderful to hear it in your voice. I was thinking about a lot about how this book is a sort of, I thought of it, the word that came to mind several times was the word braided. Like there are these braided themes that continue to sort of wrap around each other, and that it includes themes that are theological in nature, that are the body embodiment, nature and the earth. Those are braided, and they're braided together with practices like pastoral care, justice work, family life, and that kind of thing. So there's like multiple strands that go on here. And, you know, in this section, thinking a lot about this notion of the Word of God dwelling with us made me think about the question, you know, what's your answer to the what's Jesus got to do with it sort of thing. I mean, and you talk about this in some other places in the book, but I was thinking a lot about a poem by Lucille Clifton called Spring Song, which says the sweet smell of delicious Jesus is opening the house. And that like that's one end of the conversation. And you start with the end that's the death end, you know, the part that is not the fresh moment of spring, but the beginning of Lent, which it seems so appropriate to me that we're having this conversation at the beginning of Lent. So I wondered if for the audience, you could give more insight into your thinking about the body of Jesus, the broken body and the bearing the body across, as you talk about here, across the threshold, the body of Christ, the body of faithful, in your understanding in terms of like how that shows up in the book.
Yeah. I think I have to credit at this point my college pastor, because I think as preachers, people who are constantly asking questions of our sacred text and trying to discern, you know, faith seeking understanding. We're continually trying to understand or live out what does that story mean? What does our sacred story mean? What does our Jesus story mean for us? And I had a pastor who, I am like a lot of clergy, I have a lot more fun preaching Advent and Christmas texts than I do necessarily the crucifixion story. Finding the meaning in that, finding the hope in that, finding the healing in that, I think is a pretty gnarly challenge. But I had a pastor in college who said once that if we can believe in God becoming human, that's the greater, then the resurrection story is easy. And I wrote that down once, and I just have worked over it a lot. And what did he mean? If we can believe that God becomes human, then the idea of resurrection is much easier. And I think, in my faith journey, I was raised with an idea of understanding that the body of Jesus was a sacrifice to atone for broken humanity. So Jesus's body is broken because we're broken, and that is supposed to make up for it. And that's something that, over decades now, I have wrestled with, like a lot of us have wrestled with. What's that mean, and what's the implication for that? My spiritual journey, my evolution of faith, led me to I guess I can use this word since it's seminary, a Christology, or an understanding of Jesus or Christ, that has connected more to that we are united with God in Christ's body, that is part of what that is what we are signifying with the seal of baptism, that in Jesus, God joins humanity in our limitation, in our vulnerability, so that in Christ dying with us, suffering and dying with us, we can be raised with Christ to new life. So I know people struggle. I talk a little bit about the book that, depending on the congregation I'm preaching to, the idea of God being human isn't such a big deal. It's just that God was, it's more the challenge that the idea that God maybe was in one human, Jesus, that they're okay with the guy, not so much the God part of that. But for my own faith journey, the idea of God becoming one with us in the body of Jesus has been transformative. And that has informed, I think, how I approach suffering and death. I have lived experience of humans really harming one another in their bodies, and so finding that redemptive is something I couldn't accept. But understanding that God joins me in the body in which I suffer, so that I can be raised to a renewed, new body, new life, is hope for me. So I think that's been it's kind of evolved, and in the book, I originally, when I started writing into this book, I thought it was going to be about death, and I had this whole folder of death poems and death essays, and just because I'd been around a lot of death. And so part of what I was questioning was, well, is death the doorway? Is death the doorway to experience the divine? But writing into the book and seeing where it wanted to go, came more to it seems like a no-brainer now, but came more to the conclusion that it's the body, it's these bodies that are the doorway. This is our access to divinity. Our humanity is our entry point into divinity.
Yeah, and I really I had that you were clear on that in the epilogue at the end
Mhm.
about how you'd sort of traveled that journey.
Yeah, I don't want to
Um,
give it away, but yeah.
yeah, right.
But it
I
was,
know. Well, you
yeah.
don't actually. You don't. I was like, oh yeah, because after I got to the end, then I sort of went back and I could see where some of the threads were, but I didn't
Mhm.
realize that's exactly where we were headed.
Yeah,
Um, and
me
you
either when I was writing it.
is it, but that's sort of part of the fun, isn't it? And
It
I mean,
is.
of writing anyway. Yeah, and let me say, side note, Tisha's just added in the chat to please put your questions in, either in the chat or in the Q&A. We welcome them from our listeners, our audience here, because we'd like for you to participate too.
Yeah,
I wanted to say too, what was interesting to me about the very end of the book, and of course, I'm sorry to the audience for giving it away, but they won't remember all this.
no, that's
Is
okay.
that you talk about that you thought you were entering the door, that people entered the door to divinity via death, and then you realize you're doing it being embodied, or the embodiment of God in Christ or in Jesus is bringing us there. And you end with the line, with our bodies, we thee worship, which is another, you used it earlier too, but I like that because I thought, well, because once you realize that, then what do you do with the body is you treat
Mhm.
it like, it's part of the worshipful nature of our beings, toward God, oriented toward God. So the body is not the trouble locus anymore,
Mhm.
that it had been. And that was it, that was a great, like, that ending line, I was like, get it.
Thank you.
Like, all right, that's good. Because and I was thinking back to your discussions of, theological heavy hitters like Paul and Augustine, who have this dualistic view of body, spirit and body, spirit versus body. And I mean, you do take them to task in the book, based on this understanding that you have developed. You're like, well, wait a minute, why are we talking about the body in this way, like it's a vessel of sin
Mhm.
instead of a blessing? Can you talk a bit about that and how you came to sort of interrogate them or question those voices in the tradition that sort of bring us back to this dualism, between body and spirit? Because I think some people on here might be interested to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Um, I'm a pastoral theologian, not a systematic theologian. In that, I'm most interested in the impact that our theological ideas have on how we treat one another and our world. Um, and I have great respect for and loved my theology classes. I love to think and ask big questions. And reading Calvin's Institutes or anyone like that, I was always impressed, well, for example, with Calvin, with how much he cared for the humans that he was pastoring and why he was trying to dig so deeply into, well, then, how does God work? What's going on with God? What is our theology? And I love Paul. Growing up, I, heard a lot of Paul, and there are passages of Paul that still just read out loud to hear the intensity of his passion, his conviction, and his care for the churches that he's writing to. And the impact of that dualistic theology of locating everything that's wrong with us in the body has been devastating. And I would say that it has led over centuries to a violence toward our own bodies and one another's bodies. I think it's from where we stand right now, or where I stand right now in my experience, when we locate the source of evil in another person's body or our own, it makes it so much more easy to do violence to that human. And that is incongruent to me with the God who at the end of creation, and says it's good. It's very good. I think Augustine was trying very hard to figure out what was wrong with him, like we all are, like why. And he has this great story of he's really compelled by trying to figure out why he and a bunch of his buddies would destroy a pear orchard for no other reason there was no reason, but he doesn't do any kind of power analysis in there, which we might do today, or, the ways he has his own worldview in which to reflect on why would they do that. And I think he struggled with we don't have enough details, but I think he struggled possibly with some kind of, maybe we'd call it a sexual addiction today. He struggled in some way with not being able to do the good he wanted to do. So he's trying to figure out why, but locating that in what came to be called original sin, that is in our bodies, that when any human born, I had heard this phrase earlier on in life, any human born without salvation is deservedly condemned to hell. Locating that in just a human being coming into the world was a stretch in his time, and he had plenty of critics who lifted up that was a heresy of God's good creation, and it's curious to me why, when he did have plenty of critics, the move to locate sin in the human body from birth, why that prevailed. And I am curious about the power dynamics of that. Is it because it made it more possible to do violence to other human bodies? So I think that theologically, that's part of what I wanted to interrogate. I know how the theologies that I took for granted as a child, that I was formed by, I know how they impacted my treatment of my own body. And my theological question for this book is, if we reclaimed what we call in theological terms incarnation and our union with Christ, would we do less violence to our own bodies and to other people's bodies? Would we regard one another's bodies with much more dignity and respect and holiness and love? So that's kind of the theological nugget I was trying to crack. I'm sorry, I kind of mix metaphors sometimes. That's the theological nut I was trying to crack.
You can mix them all you want. No, that's really helpful. And, I was thinking, I wanted to ask a question about, there's a chapter in here called My Uncle's Magazines, in which you talk about this dualistic way of looking at the human body as it pertains to pleasure. And you talk about the difference between pornography and the erotic, as a difference between, to me, this is my interpretation, correct me if I'm misunderstanding you, but I understood that pornography is a form of consumption where we're consuming, things for whatever we want, whatever our purposes are. And the erotic is something that's creative and even justice making, that it can engage us with other people in a positive sense, and can also call for change. And so, I like that notion of the erotic in our lives as a resource or energy that we're taught to ignore or turn off. And we're actually taught to funnel it into some negative ways so that we become better consumers in this culture, in a sense. And part of that is coming from this dualistic view of, well, what do you do with this energy that's been put in the bad category? What do you use it for? And so I was kind of interested in asking you, how did you come to see the dichotomy working in that way, and to try to undercut it with your reflection? Because that seemed to me, I don't know, there's something about that seems central to all of this. One of your movements is about pleasure, after all, and not only about the pain and the death stuff, but also this stuff. And so I'm just curious about moving into that space a little bit within our conversation.
I think that's probably the more recent, gosh, there are these places where you're more open to where we are. I think there are places in our journey, our spiritual journey, our faith journey, our family journey, where we're where a little seed of something gets planted. And then later on that grows a little bit and it keeps growing. And I think one of those seeds probably was planted way back. I married pretty young. I think I lucked out. I've been married 23 years now. And our pastor in college always talked about three things with folks who were getting ready for marriage. And one was family and identity. And one was sex and intimacy. And one was money and work, right? And I remember him saying something like, as far as sexual relationships go, as far as the relationship, everything was permissible as long as, and he hinged this on the two greatest commandments, as long as it doesn't become a fetish, as long as it doesn't become an addiction, like, so the greatest commandment, love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and it doesn't humiliate, harm, or hurt your partner. And that was love your neighbor as yourself. And I was like, wow, what freedom would we know if we let the two greatest commandments be our guide for our sexual lives? Basically, he was saying we're good. We were created good for. And he didn't go all into this right now, and if he's watching now, my college pastor, he's cringing, like, I didn't say that. No, but there was a real, for me, lots of reasons, but the growing understanding and acceptance of myself as a sensual being was a project of adulthood. And I lucked out in that I found a partner who also was in a very loving and respectful place, and who honors me and honors my body. So not everybody gets that early in life. But the person who, so my college pastor was the first one to suggest that, maybe sex wasn't dirty. I know. This is things I wish I'm glad at least in my 20s it occurred, someone suggested it to me. And I also kind of wish maybe it had been more of a, it had never been an issue from through adolescence. But figuring out the social impact of how we treat bodies, like pornography, and how sexuality is a consumer product in our world. I just have to thank a lot of teachers outside of the church, actually. And the person that I had a poetry workshop teacher who said, every poem is erotic, or every prayer is erotic, because it's an address of intimacy and longing. It's a request. It's an expression of intimacy and connection. So I actually had to do a lot of work to figure out what I meant by the erotic. And Audre Lorde is kind of my primary teacher, among some other really great poets and women of color, Black women primarily, have. There were a few authors I read in college, but it's been later finding a way to understand the erotic as a different kind of thing than the pornography that we package and consume in our culture. And that it's holy, that it's a connection to God. Like, don't tell my childhood church that. Oh my gosh, that would have been that gotten me kicked out, but anyway, so that's a little bit of the journey, and I'm still learning.
Well, and I mean, of course, that essay by Audre Lorde is so important that you quote in the book. And I was flashing on when I was in that part of the book and some other ones. I was flashing on another book that's more recent that I wondered if you'd read. It's Cole Arthur Riley's This Here Flesh, and I brought.
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, do you have it too?
I do. Yeah. Right here.
Well, I haven't actually finished it yet, but it was interesting to me because I was thinking about her. You both have what I would say a strong read on the Imago Dei, that we're
Mhm,
made in the image of God and that we're good.
mhm,
And she says there's a necessary ritual of loving the flesh to love ourselves to
mhm,
survive. And of course, she's talking about that particularly from the vantage point of persons of color, and particularly those who are of African American heritage.
mhm,
But she also says, sort of more generally, the origin story of the world is that the divine is in us. And so there's this sense of like all of that creation, you know, um, that God makes, and our creation with each other, both whether that's sexually or whether that's in making things together or having community together. Like there's some notion that that is sort of a reincarnation of Imago Dei when you do that. With as you're saying that your pastor's guidance with the two commandments, primary commandments in mind, it seems to me. Um, what are your thoughts on Riley's book? And since you have it, I didn't know if you'd read
Oh,
it
I
or.
love it. It's a book. So there are books that I read because I should read them, and I read them at a different pace than the
Yeah.
books that I read because they feed me, because they're like water in the desert. And her book is one that I'm going through slowly because it is so. Another one because it is so powerful. It's like we were writing the same book from different places of
Yes.
experience, and it's just kind of wild. I have really enjoyed reading it. And there is um, you know, it strikes me that given all the different perspectives on the creation in Genesis, the different creation stories, and the different stories about the different stories that address, why do we hurt each other? Because those are the stories that come after the creation stories. God created it's good. And then there's the stories about, why do we introduce blame and shame and violence? Where's that story? It's curious to me, guys. I was reading again this week. I'm like, why did we focus so much on this Adam and Eve story, which isn't even about sex,
Right.
but and locate our fall in that story. And I know Augustine and how he's interpreting things and stuff.
Mhm.
But given all the other material there, um, why did we for so long accept that as the only narrative,
Mhm.
explanation of our relationship with God and with each other, when there is that beautiful poem in the first chapter of God creating everything and it was good, and the beautiful story of God breathing, God forming the human out of the dust and breathing God's own breath into the human. Like there are so many other powerful and beautiful ways to understand where we come from in that sense,
Mhm.
and our relationship with the divine creative energy that makes the world. Um, why did we accept that this really destructive um, theological thread? Um, so
I
I
kind of
really, really
I
enjoy
wondered if it got
this
back
research.
to journalism. If it bleeds, it leads. You know what
Yes.
I mean? Like, well, I mean,
That
just
is a great, yeah, that is a great connection. Yeah, if it bleeds, it leads. I mean, um, there is a there is a fascination with the grotesque and with
yeah,
other people's suffering too.
yeah,
And I've found that, and there are moments of being horrified by it. There are you know, cinematic portrayals of Jesus's crucifixion where I'm like, I don't understand. Like, are people getting off on this? Like, like
right.
it's an almost glorying in the suffering. It's like
Mhm.
finding pleasure in another human suffering, and
Yeah,
um that's that gives me pause
yeah,
um, about
yeah.
the impact, as I said earlier, on our theology and how we actually treat each other.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, there's a way that those images sort of turn into an objectification that is pornographic. I mean, like if you
Hmm.
take the kind of the idea of what that is, it's just meant
And
for. salacious consumption or whatever.
Absolutely. And I would say that that's happening currently too, with
Yeah.
videos of young men being killed by police. So
Yeah.
those, how those become viral, young Black men, I should say, being killed by police. The way those become viral becomes a consumptive, a consumption of violence against other human bodies. And it's, I don't know, I'm very sensitive to violent images myself, so there are films I can't watch anyway. I didn't often share those videos, but I made a pact a number of years ago. I'm not going to share a video of a Black person being violently attacked by by someone else, even if it's viral, even if it's like the news story of the day. That's part of, some of my questions of moving out of journalism were because of those deeper questions. What's the impact of us repeatedly showing these images in this way? I had started a Master of Arts in Media Management, partly because I wanted to ask the ethical questions. How is the story we're telling reinforcing or not harmful and untrue narratives about our neighbors?
Well, and it's interesting to me, and I just want to note that everybody out there, if you have questions, put them in the chat, because we've only got a few minutes left. I feel like I've been dominating, but
that's okay.
So interesting.
This Here Flesh, Cole Arthur
Yeah.
Riley.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I put it in This Here Flesh by Cole Arthur Riley, and I spelled it wrong in the first case. I was thinking about this in terms of you note it a couple of times, or maybe more than that the US, despite these obsessions with these images and with the some of the films about Jesus that show the crucifixion at heart, like way up close and real, intense violence. And yet we are a death averse culture. So there's this
weird.
It's like this strange, it's almost a schizophrenic thing, right? Because on the one hand, we are consuming all this stuff that's interested in death, horror films and all this kind of stuff. And then on the other hand, there's like this way that we want to keep death away from us. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit, because that is such an odd deal to me. The way that we swing between those things.
I think it's an expression of our denial. If we could deal with death in whole and healthy ways, we would be more accustomed to the humanity of it, to the love that can be, and the hardness that can be in a room when a loved one is dying, actively dying. And I think it's an expression of, it's the same thing with the erotic. If we can't approach it as part of the dignity and humanity and sacredness of our human existence, our unconscious knows it's part of us, and so it's gotta deal with that in some way. So then we have this incredible business of online pornography. I mean, it's just exploded. It's where we get most of our technological advances, so I think it's that not the resisting the honesty of this part of our human, another book I want to recommend is Suzanne Roberts' Animal Bodies. It's not religious at all, but what she identifies is the parts of us that are most animal, we are least willing to accept honestly. They make us uncomfortable. And when we won't do that, when we won't face our animalness, our creatureliness, our createdness, then then our need to deal with that gets pushed under into the unconscious, and it comes out in weird ways, consumptive ways. I'm making up words again.
No, it's making sense to me.
But that, so I think they're both, I was actually going to name those two chapters, Eros and Pathos, because the suffering is part of our human createdness, the part of us being animals, and also the pleasure of the body is also part of us being animals, like and I don't say that disparagingly, but we're mammals, we give birth to live young and nurse them. So it's part of us trying to deal with that. And I think that our kind of the downside of being human is that denial is our superpower. And when we deny our humanity, our limitedness, our Niebuhr would say our finitude, that's when we break things, ourselves and other people.
We have a question from Mary Lynn. She asks, if you feel these videos that we were just talking about should not be shared, does that suppress the grievous way these men are being treated? Does that allow us to close our eyes to the horrors suffered by the Black community?
That is a good question. And I think the only people who can answer it are the Black community. And I think that part of my decision in deciding never to share those videos has been by listening to the way it re-traumatizes my Black friends and family. So I think if we are listening, I think especially with sharing or raising awareness, we always have to ask the question of the impact on the population that is most vulnerable to the thing. So so what is the impact on the Black mothers in my circles? What is the impact on the Black fathers in my circle when those kinds of things are shared? I think that's got to be our guide when we're raising awareness, and to let the folks who are most impacted by the injustice that's happening set the agenda for what needs raised, how and where, and follow their lead. So I hear that, because I don't, as a journalist, I want the reality, I want the truth to be told. And the truth could be told in ways that don't turn those videos into an item of mass consumption on social media.
Yeah, that's part of one of the things I like about your book, and also things I'm searching for in my own work, are how do we talk about these difficult matters in ways that are truthful and yet don't reinscribe some of the same traumas and colonialist patterns and all of that I think we see all around, all around us, even in the way the news covers things, and in the way that social media goes viral. And it's sort of like, how do we be a non-anxious presence and still be truth tellers, or still be prophets, without also like ratcheting up everybody to the point where they just keep the same cycle going.
I had some questions about that and choices I made in the book too. And I don't think I'll ever say 100% I made the right call. But there's that question always when you're writing, whose story am I telling, and is it mine to tell? And so I made a few decisions in the book, and what I included. I don't know, 2 years later, I would have made the same decision, or I may have, I may have. And any work, like a book or an article or an essay or poem, is one moment in the conversation. So I just want to acknowledge that I continue to learn. I don't believe I've always made the right call in that. There are some news stories I think about from my very early time in journalism where I'm like, I would not write that story that way now. And I would have.
It's good to grow.
Yes, right.
That's when you're, younger, and just think, I might do that differently. I know we're at 6:02, and I want to acknowledge a couple of our attendees who have made comments. Joanne has said, thank you for writing this book and for the book talk. This is such an important topic. Thanks, Joanne. And we have an anonymous attendee in the Q&A who said, this has been a wonderful conversation. As a woman, I have tended to the cycles and seasons of my body and to experience the divinity, the creator within. And then the person offers a reflection. Your book title of Loving What Doesn't Last reminds me of the Buddhist understanding of impermanence, a tradition I practice along with Christianity. Today, the incarnation and impermanence were woven together. wonderful and continues my curiosity. That's so lovely. Thank you for the anonymous person.
Yeah.
I guess I probably ought to wrap it up. I mean, I so hate to do it, Christina, but we try to keep
That's
our
okay.
promises like close to an
Yep,
hour.
yep. And I do want to offer that
Oh,
I
yeah,
just want
yeah.
to, as a thank you for anybody who attended today, if you want to put your contact information in the chat, I would love to send you a personalized book plate. It's totally up to you, but I just want to thank you. I know online things aren't the most fun, and I'm also really grateful for your presence and your participation and your comments and your good questions. I would love to continue the conversation. So if you put your contact info in the chat or message the host or panelist, I'll send you a nameplate, book plate.
Yeah, we'll be happy to share that. It's such a great idea. And thank you for that generous offer, Christina. It's so it's just a great way to make some contact, with people. Some people are saying they'll message the team. So yeah, we welcome everybody to email us. If you want to email me, I'll put my email in the chat just in case you can't find us somewhere else. And I've got to do the wrap up, but I want to say as I do that, Christina, that part of what I loved about your book was that it models the kind of intimacy you're encouraging us to have. And so I felt somehow close to you, not in a kind of a weird succubus sort of way, but what I felt like an embrace by the book. And I think that's a real accomplishment for a writer to offer, especially when you're writing about difficult topics, and some of these are much more difficult to tackle. And so I'm really grateful for the book for that, because it felt like I was meeting a friend. And so I'm grateful for that, and grateful for your work, and I'm sure, and your ministry as well, which includes your writing. I want to encourage our audience to check out the links that were provided to the LibGuide, so you can learn more about Christina's work, as well as booksellers where you can buy her book, and also her website as well. So if you want to go find out more about her from her directly, please do that. I want to say thanks to the audience for joining us today. I appreciate the questions we have had. Wish we had more, but still, it's great that you've all been here to join us for this. And we'll be back here in April for our next book talk. Stay tuned about that. And I hope everybody has a great weekend and a lot to ponder as we begin Lent. Kathy Costanzo has asked for the link to Christina's site one more time before we go. And so I want to say to everybody, happy reading and writing. And again, thanks so much, Christina. It's a pleasure to meet you in this way.
Thank you, Shan. It was really a delight. It was really, really fun. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Bye, everybody.
Have a good one.
Thank you.